more likely it's resolved that way. So with that little sound issue dealt with, welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are working on how motion is affected by how you're feeling in matches and how to avoid wasting your effort, your energy, your meter, your focus. You can get pretty good at these things if you can control those. And of course we have bots for the purposes entirely of working on that sort of thing, which is what Kazuki Dynasty has been poking at for the last couple of days. She managed to reach that state, that zen state, a little while back, but it's hard to hold that for too long. And to be fair, we didn't even use it on Street Fighter. We decided, oh good, you should probably be able to go do Helena work now. So we now have mostly a Helena bot for Dead or Alive that you may see later. The other thing to understand is that a lot of the time, especially for a frustration player, it's the job of your opponent to stop that function of your skill from working. And that in itself will change your emotions, even if it doesn't specifically put you on tilt. Today's lounge is 3 rounds, first to 2. We're back to the first to 2 format for the purposes of this. As this is no longer about adaptation, we are moving on from that to specifically thinking about how to make yourself move correctly. Or rather, in some cases, not move. Depending on your perception of footsies, this can be a very easy thing or an extremely hard thing. But the more important thing is to recognize when it's happening. Whether or not you can necessarily do anything about it in any given round is not really the point. It's just a good thing to get used to having to do in fighting games. And it can in itself be the fun part. If you're not too freaked out by the situations you end up in, for example. But most of us are going to be, until you play it for a while, until you have a certain type of confidence, which some people get simply by winning a lot. Some people get it by being told that they're really doing well. Some people get it by just being so arrogant that it doesn't matter to them and they'll eventually just pick it up. Whichever type of person you are, the important thing is to realize that you are going to at some point need it. Not necessarily because you aren't good at the game, but because the game is multiple parts, and one of those parts is being super calm about things when your opponent's entire goal is to make you very much not calm. This match is a good way to start that off, as both these players are quite good at doing that to each other's mindsets. When you find yourself thinking, wait, what are they doing? That's it, you've started thinking. It's actually interesting because most of us move around in neutral less as we become more confident. Even if we're afraid of the opponent in question, fighting games are a lot about trying to separate the part of you that plans your ideas from the part of you that executes them. Many of us fear the opponent taking their turn forever, for example, and it makes us move when really the opponent could really try to do that. There are many characters who just do get to keep on trying to take their turn indefinitely. If you don't go for one of your harder counters or think more carefully about why it's working out that way. While that did work out closely to the end, the last Seppo was probably more of what I was talking about. To get close to the opponent so that things don't start happening that you then have to react to or deal with. And part of the reason why we keep on suggesting bots for this purpose is simply that you fought the opponent so much that you don't have any expectation of anything being confusing. You've seen the character do most of the things the character will ever do. You've possibly even come up with some ridiculous responses, and while you might not be able to do them all, at least you're not likely to be freaked out by the opponent's effort.
Let's do this.
So, they help you build up your experience for understanding your options, and that's really important in these games. For today, therefore, we're not necessarily going to be talking a whole lot because, rather than speaking about easily visible things or mistakes that can be said in terms of, well, you were supposed to punish this way, or your game plan was off in this other way, this is a lot more subtle. And remembering all of your options can be really hard, which is partially why we suggest writing notes on them and so on, just so you don't have that additional layer of stress with everything else you have to do. Unfortunately, our guild bot does not have gills overhead, so you would not get used to that one. You can put it in, I think. But even then, that moment of being completely confident in even the small gaps between your opponent's pressure, the ways you can move to get away from things that they're doing, what exactly they add to the game for you may vary, more so depending on whether or not you actually can execute them. But the concept doesn't change. The more confident you are, the easier it is to not waste any motion.
Round one. Fight!
If you remember for our little history lesson, actually the birth of bots was entirely to help deal with understanding situations, learning about scrambles, mostly to deal with Ken. And as we noted, we're not expecting a whole bunch of other characters, we're not expecting a whole bunch of other specific ways to play the game to come up. We've tested most of, if not all of our bots. We know which ones may need new inputs or styles or entirely new bots in order to make use of their B skill 2 or any changes they received in championship position. that leaves us at the place where we mostly have this. We're past the checking on the poverty life. We're past the moment of deciding whether or not it's a good idea for everyone to have every bot so that we can't actually tell if they're helping. We now know what they do, and we can easily see which parts of the situation don't get improved by them, and the player has to deal with them on a mental level. Mostly that's the sort of thing we end up talking about in these nudges.
Gil wins.
But that means we will be seeing more of the team with Championship Edition and more of the team with access to any bot they want easily. Whereas normally we sometimes only used bots when we were hanging around before together. In any case, yes, as always, feel free to join us. We are running a US East Coast lounge, basically, mostly PS4. Search for Siren in the 3 rounds, first 2, with character select off.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! You win! Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! You win! It's go time! Let's do this!
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Harmony. That is the truth of what you miss.
In most modern fighting games, the strategic aspect is enough work on its own that you really don't want to be spending too much time worrying about the execution. But execution isn't really a problem. I mean, obviously it is one, but you can just grind execution. Execution under stress is harder to grind, but still technically not too difficult. We're not talking about execution at this point, we're specifically referring to getting too twitchy and wasting motion such that you end up trying to react to something that hasn't happened yet, just to stop the opponent from having an option. But you don't really have a good way to prevent that option, you're just doing something so that they don't do something themselves. The usual problem with this is they get to choose all of their stuff based on thinking that you want them to not hit buttons.
Round 2.
And while this sounds more like a recipe for whiff punishing, not really. In a game with big enough knockdowns that can sometimes happen from slow earn moves, it's not really likely to be the first strategy most people use. The first strategy most people use is going to be randomly doing their knockdown move in hopes that you did something to make yourself over. Because the faster they get into the pressure situation, the worse situation you're in.
The curtain falls.
There's one good example. Even though it's a little bit harder online, due to the difference in frames at least a bit, it's still mostly, especially if you've got enough health, a generally good response to seeing Gil's trigger to the down dice to hit him. Even if you end up getting hit because of like 1 or 2 extra frames added onto your reaction time, it's generally not something that Gil easily deals with. Some characters get to hold a lot of control using this, and Karina is obviously no exception, as by most standards she's about the best character in the game right now, if you know what you're doing.
Fall time.
The key therefore being not to fold.
You win.
There are a few characters in the game with pressure so good that your chance will not come at all.
Round 1. Fight.
Becoming more and more comfortable in these situations allows you to use more of your options, even if they're not completely safe.
This ice shall be all too.
Round 2. Fight.
Pyrokinesis.
After all, eventually, you are going to lose some matches. Everyone loses some matches. Generally, you won't be lost because of your character's most weaknesses. In Karina's case, the fact that she has to deal with a lot of zoning at the mid-range, which is where she excels, combined with the fact that she has relatively low health.
You lose.
But how you choose to deal with this and what parts of it you remember are dependent on other things. Part of what makes this matchup work for her is sometimes backdashing out of that range.
Round 1.
And part of what makes Gil able to beat that is him being able to read when that's going to happen and make the right call with one of his short lariats. As one gets more and more tense, the feeling that you must do something but can't do something often gets into your emotions. And there's very little most players can do about that. Top level players just tend to train more and more until it's gone away. Mid-level players tend to try to change the situation so it's never happening, or rely on their damage to win the round anyway. Low-level players may not even notice. Which of course is the hardest thing for you, to not even recognize that the thing that you're doing is a problem you're creating for yourself. But there you see the short lariat, and the reasons why this move is so good for Gil in this matchup. most of Korean's options simply don't do it.
You lose. Let's do this.
Harmony. That is the
Round one. Fight.
cryokinesis. Pyrokinesis. The curtain falls. Be gone. Sleep. Freeze up. Fall down.
Round two. Fight.
Try. Cryokinesis. It is time to proceed with the plan.
Final round. Fight.
Pyrokinesis. Cryokinesis.
Necalli wins. Round one. Fight!
Sometimes, in fact, you can get good enough at the game to make your weaknesses disappear somewhat this way. In general, in Cosmic Wolf's play, he becomes a little predictable when being pressured, but because his playstyle doesn't tend to lead to being pressured very often, or the hits he does take do not lead to the familiar pressure situations for most opponents, you get a lot more air resets or specific off spacings in some way. It's a lot harder for a player who has been put under that pressure for so long to go, oh right, yeah, I forgot. Well, to remember that he tends to wake up with buttons. It's much easier to get into the trap of, okay, I finally got this character down, and then, because of the emotions he creates in the neutral of the match,
Round two.
go for pressure, and often get uppercut. So as you don't get uppercut, you just get crouch medium punch, but the concept is often the same, because the unfamiliar situation is similar. It's, oh, Necalli, I have pressure now. Which pressure string am I supposed to use? And by the time you've remembered that he did back roll or something, you don't have the exact punish or the exact frame trap ready anymore. This is meaningful because if you end up in that binary state of pressure on, or remembering halfway through letting the pressure come on that you need to have it off, it makes the crouch medium punch wake up so much more effective. Most characters do get to hit a plus button on wake up, even if they have to basically rely on whatever their 3-frame happens to be. But usually they don't get quite as much advantage, pushback, situational setups as Necalli does with wake up crouch medium punch.
Final round.
Meaning that you have put yourself next to a character who at least somewhat benefits from that positioning. And then, because you were not specifically planning, okay, I'm going for pressure right now because he's likely to wake up with this button. In fact, you ended up maybe thinking, oh right, I shouldn't do that right now. I'm already close, but he tends to wake up with uppercuts, so I should block. Now you've got to be pushed around. Players can, and often do, build this sort of thing into their styles, even if they don't mean to do it. It's simply that visible flaws are the ones people work on first. Flaws that are hidden by the rest of their style, that they don't encounter causing losses too much, aren't usually an issue. And that's a natural part of fighting games. As you get better and better, you fight people who are more and more able to expose or deal with those specific flaws, and then you end up working on those, and you get better. You shouldn't necessarily get confused that you have them, even quote-unquote after so long, because it's simply hard to work on certain ones outside of matches. If you're fortunate and you can figure out exactly how to apply some training mode system, some bots, some... even just watching matches and simulating your own responses in the same situation can work out for this. but that doesn't mean it's ever going to be easy to do. Stuff like that.
Round 2. Fight.
Cryokinesis. 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 Pyrokinesis.
Gil therefore has a lot of good reasons to parry in this particular matchup. Necalli has lots of options that involve even doing slightly delayed things, or things that get him advantage, mainly because you can't risk waiting to make sure he doesn't do them. Gil and other characters with parries often get around this whole concept. Necalli does have good crush counters against them to take advantage of that, but compared to most characters, they're not super overwhelming at first. That's a whole learned process, and it has to do with a bunch of stuff related to how well you can confirm certain things. So, with a sufficient sense of spacing, Necalli does get to poke and push around people quite a bit, but Gil's parrying at the exact right moment just breaks the whole chain, and takes victories that other characters would have to risk a much bigger deal for. Not specifically because it's really that much harder to crush counter Gil's parry than it is to crush counter an uppercut, let's say. But it is actually fairly important because, if it's never occurred to you before, when you do a move like an uppercut, you actually have a really long time to do it if the uppercut hits, because the block stun is factored in. You had time to see a move you recognize, to block that move, and then wait and set up for your punish. Parries get away from this in a lot of situations because some of them are not particularly obvious, and Gil's probably the least obvious. Combined with the fact that if you don't recognize it in time and try to go for something, Gil is not a character that really suffers from having to get out of your block string eventually. He might just parry again and the whole thing would go terribly for you.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round 1. Fight. Round one. Fight!
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Round two. Fight! You win! It's go time! Let's do this!
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight! Round 2. Fight! You win! Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight! You win! It's go time! Let's do this!
One of the most difficult aspects of this is actually the fact that as you get better, the match automatically becomes more tense. So you have to keep on leveling up this specific skill. The better you play, and the better your opponent plays in response, especially if they're like your training partners who will often, at least if they've got the same types of emotional control, if they're at the same emotional maturity level relative to the game in question, most of the time they'll move to match whatever you're doing, even if they temporarily blip, lose their temper, lose their control.
Round 1.
That could result in them winning or losing.
Fight.
It might be cathartic for them to win, it might sometimes make them frustrated at themselves for doing it. It depends on the person. But the more tense the match gets, the more on edge everyone must be by default. You would think that you can't necessarily spend a lot of time just standing there in neutral, catching your breath, but that is absolutely not true. It's just that the highest level players you tend to see in this game have gone past that point where they no longer need to do it that way. And yes, the highest level players will absolutely try to take advantage of it if you breathe for a moment, because they'll use it to get into the correct spaces. And of course, if you then have to go, oh no, they're moving in, that's the spacing, I need to change the spacing, then obviously your tension continues. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can never overcome this. In fact, in a lot of games, every time you get hit, if you can learn to let go and breathe in that moment of getting knocked down, of getting hit, you can even use it to cause your wake-up timings to change depending on yourself as a person. If you notice that you almost always just mash buttons immediately as soon as you are going to get knocked down, it might be time to consider the fact that you probably should be trying to catch your breath a bit. As you get better at footsies, for example, or more familiar with the matchup, you might be able to play footsies without thinking about it, which means you get to breathe, while your body more or less automatically does the repositioning for you. This is a good way to not get tired in a lot of games, especially games like Street Fighter where most characters don't have instant ways to get to you. Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, to some extent Dead or Alive, these sorts of games, most people can't just teleport to you or instant air dash at varying heights that you have to anti-air with like 6 different normals. Those high-tension games, or in certain cases high-tension characters, for example Dalsim can be like that in this game a little bit, even those can be dealt with separately. You kind of learn to physically do those things. Guilty Gear might be the extreme example, maybe not Strive, but we don't know for sure yet. But most games it doesn't work that way. There's not enough ways your opponent can quickly reach you to cause trouble that are also unreactable, safe, knockdowns, problems of big magnitude, that you have to think that way. If you teach your body to play footsies on its own, and you can use nearly all bots for that. If the specific character made the bot for happens to be very aggressive or not play that style, there's almost always some other character with a very similar style where you can learn it. And we only have a few really aggressive bots. And we know this works at high levels. We know it can be done against bots because given enough time, you will get used to some crazy things. If you thought being able to throw Abigail's hypercharge was a bit of an edge, you can throw Gil out of lariats. You can also much more easily crouch medium kick him out of lariats with a lot of characters. But you can absolutely throw Gil out of lariat. It's just that you have like one frame to do this, and why would you ever want to? But the idea that, oh, I've seen this spacing, my opponent probably isn't going to do anything. And your body just automatically does the throw when you see something that looks like a lariat. And most of the time you don't get hit for doing it either. This is a matter of physical memory, it is a matter of pattern recognition. It's the sort of thing you have to train for a long time, just for the visuals of it. And it's hard to use in matches because it's not like most people will just do lariat randomly at the spacing. It's technically the wrong spacing for lariat. But for many people, there's not much feelings better than being able to do that thing automatically. That one, for example, is just very useful. If you train against our guildbot for even a rudimentary amount of time, you will just almost always react to ice with some hit. And all you have to do most of the time, depending on your character I guess, is confirm into the knockdown. Not every character has an easy way to get away from the ice, but it doesn't really matter so much if you combo into something that knocks skill down fairly early into the cancel. Then you get frozen, but so what? This is not going to save you against most skill because most skill will have like massive numbers of setups for that move. And probably not overuse the spacing for it once they realize that you can just do that. We're already seeing the president start to shift to repositioning the move, using it as a way to catch people backing away in situations that he knows it's not going to work for pressure. And mostly it's just a matter of Korean having one of the best crouch medium kicks ever to deal with it, even at a range where otherwise it would be, I won't call it impossible, but detrimental to do it. Most characters trying to do those sorts of things at those ranges will land the crouch medium kick, but because of the delay in it, they'll get caught before they can do the cancel, or the cancel will not be a true cancel string, and Gil will be able to block, not get knocked down, etc, etc. So we're already starting to see that.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight!
Oh my!
Round two. Fight!
I shall attack! I shall attack! Weak!
You lose. Round one. Fight! Round 2. Fight!
Street Fighter, in fact, as a game, is just at that level where max level skill, highest level play is almost entirely about just how much can you stress out your opponent in order to make them make mistakes. Lower level players often have to deal with situational unfamiliarity or just execution issues on top of everything else. And that's where the practice part comes in. In the end, we rewarded for practicing more, like most sports. But the thing you're getting is often just the mental state required to do it. The experience comes in. But a lot of people get certain types of breakthrough more so from the mental side than anything else. For example, having the presence of mind to do something like that. Oh, I dropped my confirm. Okay, I'll parry now. The chances of that working, I'd say, are very high regardless. Until your opponent sees that you've done it, it's not likely to come up.
Round 1. Fight!
This is actually something that is really important for your skill at using your bypass neutral moves. Because having the precise sense of when to bypass neutral, when your opponent has become tense enough, or for some people comfortable enough to feel that footsies is going to happen, and to break that expectation. Similar things happen when you've gotten used to the idea of, okay, I've made a mistake, I'm going to completely drop all my commitment to this moment. I've already made an error. If my opponent doesn't capitalize on this, then I'm best off when I'm completely flagged my mistake. I can deal with more things. If you're not committed anymore to whatever happened a moment ago, you're much better off. But I didn't tech the throw, I didn't punish the swing, I didn't... Anti-air. All of those things are just more stress stacking onto you.
Round 2.
And that's why you get the commentator mention that people are... that they smell blood, basically. That they know they have managed to stress you out enough that they can get away with more things, not less. So if nothing else, training to not be stressed out when certain things don't go your way will just improve you. Just straight up. This is universally true for fighting games.
You win.
The other way around it is obviously to train so hard on execution that you don't make mistakes. But it's often true that people who do this as their method, when eventually forced into mistakes by a stronger player, take it a lot harder and are less able to adapt. They crack more easily.
It's go time.
But you're not going to crack if you are less
Let's do
rigid in
this.
the first place.
I'll show you the divide in our class.
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Final round. Fight. Round one. Fight!
I'll admit that you have some skill.
Round two. Fight! You win! It's go time! Let's do this!
We do often find ourselves thinking or feeling that things are just going downhill. And you know what? You're right. Things are usually just going downhill. When people tell you things like, well, look on the bright side of a situation when you fail something and your opponent killed you with super everything. The bright side of that is that your opponent doesn't have any meter. That bright side only really matters if your opponent needed meter. Everything does have to happen within context, but at the same time, a lot of the hey, think positive mindset comes from a place that is intended to help in a way that it doesn't really always convey. While thinking positive might not work because the situation might simply have no positive side to it, many of us can manage to feel or think nothing. Or at least to take the negative feeling in context of something else, especially if we've prepared ourselves for that beforehand. If you know you haven't trained enough to get this combo done, and you lose because you didn't manage to do the combo, then there's nothing to be upset about other than the fact that you didn't have enough training time. You can be mad at your boss for making you work overtime and missing your training session. You can be mad at that one annoying crazy uncle you have that always tried to make things seem like they were terrible. Has now given you a whole complex about these things. But being mad at the match, being mad at the game, being mad at your opponent, you can do those things, they just usually lead to you losing. And the reason they lead to you losing isn't because, oh, when you're mad, you lose. It's that most people getting mad raises their tension, and it makes them waste motion. They want to do more things. And If you are already having execution problems and stress, and you get mad and want to do more things, guess what usually happens? Your execution is still bad. Your judgment is still terrible. Unless you ascend to some Zen state. I can say Super Saiyan, right? We play enough Dragon Ball that I can say Super. Unless you ascend to Super Saiyan, it's not really helping you. If you're the type that can. Because some people can. Some people get mad and get better. Partially because it changes the opponent's expectations. But if that opponent knows, oh, I've got you mad now, so you're going to do more things, so I just have to defend for a little bit. That's not positive, it's just going to end the same way. If you, of course, are the sort of person who has labbed out 19 different mix-ups off of one thing, and being mad makes you activate the coolest one that your opponent has never seen before, that's a different matter. More power to you in that case. But most of us don't do less when we're mad. Most of us don't calmly wake up throw when we're mad. Most of us wake up uppercut because how dare this opponent keep on trying to pressure me after I have clearly showed them the last 3 times that this shouldn't work. But this is a process, and it's usually a really long one for most players.
Fight!
So it's important often to get used to the idea that it will be like this. Otherwise you'll end up not playing the game as much, which means that you really aren't getting your practice, and you're not going to get better. All that will happen is that the situation will repeat itself. You will realize you haven't trained enough, drop a combo, get mad that you dropped the combo, rage quit, turn off the game. Most of us won't rage quit, but you know, the same concept is there. You are upset, so you don't really want to play anymore. Or you keep on playing and play worse, therefore building up even more negativity toward it, and then you don't play the game for a week. And you didn't get your practice in. So, I'm definitely not the type who would ever tell you think positive. In my situation, I just think nothing. If negative feelings do come, they do take a little while to go away, but a lot of the time, depending on the framing of the situation, they do go away. And if there's nothing good to feel, so, oh, I didn't practice enough, so I lost. That's just a fact. You don't really have to take any meaning from it.
Final round.
If you are the type that actually watches streams, well, most of the better, nicer streams with, like, commentators who have empathy for other human beings. You'll notice that a lot of the time that's all they'll say. It's an unfortunate drop. I guess that person needs more practice. I guess that person needs more work on this thing. You can go back to commentary of matches you have had at majors, or sometimes even like locals, and use the commentator's perspective to tell you where you went wrong, because you might not have been feeling that at the time. Now they could be entirely incorrect about everything that they have to say, but you can also look at why they came to the conclusion, and again, if they're not like terrible hacks and spend most of their time putting down players, your general ability would be to look at the situation before they had to say that and go, oh yeah, that's why that happened. Or if you already knew it, then you didn't have to say anything because you know you dropped the combo because you don't practice the combo enough. Does that mean you should practice the combo more? Some people do, and some people just go, I should get used to losing when I drop that combo. Either way works, as long as you can keep up your willingness to keep playing.
Let's do this.
Harmony. That
Round one. Fight!
Pyrokinesis. Scatter.
Round two. Fight!
Die. Cryokinesis. Cryo. This ice shall be your doom.
Final round. Fight!
I know all. Pyrokinesis. Scatter. Cryokinesis.
Gil wins.
One of the strongest effects on most of us is, however, execution failure of a specific type. There's a type where it's like, okay, my opponent has jumped through, I'm not fast enough on this anti-air, that sucks. But the really frustrating type for most people is when you're meant to do one thing and you get something else. Most of us are seriously stressed out by this because, one, it usually leads to an entirely wrong feeling. You had the right read, you had the right decision, you knew exactly what was supposed to happen, you even had the timing, but something, I don't know, maybe your input was slightly off somehow. And now you're all stressed out because of this. Don't let anyone tell you that you shouldn't, like, take a break at that point. This is why online is not always the best for this, because you can't just say, okay, you know what, I'm going to character select, give me a moment. And why it's actually easier for some people to play characters who don't have the problem, who just flatly don't tend to have moves that overlap in that way. Characters like Akuma have a lot of things that overlap in that way. It's actually what makes it relatively complex to play. You do have to do at least some work in terms of making sure that specific things you do don't become other things.
Round two. Fight!
Sunter is actually sort of cursed in that he plays a lot of characters like this. Mainly because they tend to be designed for players like him, but it's still a real shame sometimes to have the full intent to have this thing happen. Absolutely know what you plan to do and why, and then something else happens and you like completely lose control of your movement because your character has no health and no options in certain spaces. Especially because for many people, getting the combo right doesn't really feel all that great. It's just what was supposed to happen.
Final round. Fight.
Learning how to cool off in one way or another can really help. But some of us don't want to do that. So instead you should focus mainly on not forgetting options that they have as a result of being put in that situation. Unfortunately, the more options your character has, the more confusing and difficult it is to do. Especially when they have options that aren't all mixed up at the same range. When you have a relatively clear option for every range, your opponent learns to recognize those ranges. And then when they have managed to stress you out, they can basically figure out what's going to come. Even for characters with lots of options, the important thing is more so to have those options not overlap with each other a whole ton.
Let's do this.
Well, ain't you a high-def picture of strength? I'm shaking here.
Round one. Fight.
Well, we now have a newcomer, and a character that we don't often see either in lounge or in game, so it's not as if most people have an Ed bot. They have managed to get some time with Ed bot when the character has been free. He's a relatively easy bot to input for most people, and the hardest input he has mostly controls how well he jumps and does one specific move, so you get at least the basics of Ed.
Round two.
But we've always found ourselves with the problem that Ed players either play really good footsies or no footsies. Meaning that if you are facing one, you're likely to either get overwhelmed by how good their footsies are, which is what appears to be the case here, or have to completely deprogram yourself from the concept of even trying, because footsies is not going to happen, just don't do it. But in this case, we're going to looks like we're going to get some valuable practice with the second type of Ed. The type that will literally use footwork to drive you crazy. And if you can't deal with it, well, that's too bad, because that's what the character does. He's considered not very strong in the game, but honestly, that's really
Ed
not the
wins.
point of Ed. He could be stronger, but he would have to be stronger in some form of special move way. Basically, Ed's normals and Ed's spacing and walk speed are already close to the max you get for that. He's on par with Kareen in a lot of ways.
Round 1.
He just doesn't get as good a set of confirms off of it, and they kept on increasing that, so maybe he actually has a lot of them now. He also has the benefit that you can't use certain game plans against him as a character at all. They just don't work. And having the mindset that goes with that can make certain Ed players terrifying because they know exactly what you're trying to do and they will just beat you up for it before you even start. We can already see signs of that here. Timing of that jump, for example. Ed is a character that jumps at other people when they do certain things specifically, but doesn't really need to jump all that much, which is why the Ed bot is built such that he basically barely jumps, but when he does jump, it's usually because you've either hit him or one of his moves has missed in a way that would make it so you can't actually do anything. Ed players tend to master the jumping thing fairly early, as he's just good at jumping. As a character, we suggest to you to play Ed and jump.
Round 2. Fight.
It's not that you should just jump at people all the time, but understanding that this is one of Ed's better tools in a lot of situations means that you think of it as something to use in those situations. It's particularly helpful if your opponent doesn't think you're going to jump for one reason or another. Unlike Ken, who we had a whole study on how Ken eventually pushes you out of the range of his normals and then jumps, and he basically has to. I mean, there are Ken players who will punish you if you try to poke him out of it, but if you just don't, then he doesn't have a ton of options without winter. Ed is the opposite of that. Ed can stay in, or jump, or back off and then jump. He's not exactly an easy character to pin down. But there is a little bit, as I said, of Edbot training. And a lot of Edbot training is almost entirely reliant on understanding I get to throw at this spot, or I get to dash and throw at this timing. Understanding when to throw Ed is a large part of at least the bot style. Whether or not your own character benefits from this as their game plan depends on a lot of things, but if you train against Edbot in the intended way, you will certainly learn to do it, and then you can decide whether or not it's a good thing for you or not. He's also not the strongest of characters when faced with the throw tech spacing. Most characters have superior options at the space you encounter after throw teching. Meaning that Ed does lose out a little bit even if he manages to tech all these throws. This comes up the most in the fact that once you do learn to dash in and throw him, you can learn to dash up and block him. And you can learn to dash up and jab him, and in some cases, depending on the speed of your opponent, you can dash up, jab, and then block, and he will still miss with his uppercut. Because it's really slow, in case you didn't know. The main downside of characters like Ed, and to some extent, I guess you'd say Chun-Li and Cody now, is that despite the fact that they're given projectiles, these projectiles play into their actual game plans very little in most cases. They're there for pressure strings against characters who have either floaty jumps or that you just want slightly further away from you. You just add in the fireball to increase the pushback, and basically nothing else. However, for Ed, this is a big deal. Ed controls the space that people are at next to him without having to worry about being parried in most cases, or them doing certain types of invincible moves.
I'm shaking here.
He can just use his spark, not necessarily even throw the projectile, but just use the spark to keep people in place. It does not work so well on Akali though, so I'm not expecting to see a lot of that.
Round 2.
The key to dealing with this character, therefore, is actually to feel out when he wants to do certain things, notice when he's slightly too far away to actually throw you, and break his expectations using your V-reversals. It takes a little bit too long to get into spacing again from most people's V-reversals, giving them not quite advantage, but converting the situation they were in to one that more suits them. Because you don't really want Ed close to you and controlling all of this weird things. But at the same time, getting out of this requires you to understand Ed block strings enough to decide, you know what, I don't want this particular one to keep going. Even if that means that the Ed player can recognize this and throw you, a lot of the time, if you're not too close to the corner already, you don't even care. Because it changes it from a situation where he might convert into huge damage to a throw knockdown, which is honestly not the worst against this character.
Ed wins.
Most characters now don't get much off throws, but more specifically, there are characters who at least will get to B+ off their throws. They will get into a space, they will hit a very plus button, and
Round
pressure
1.
has started again.
Fight.
Ed is not a character you can afford to have this happen against. Fortunately, he's not been really given that ability that much. He can get into positions for it, but the spacing from it tends to be a little bit predictable, so you don't really care. So overall, you should probably consider your V-reversal to be an important part of this match. Particularly because many of Ed's cancels are meant to more so put a thing in front of you if you're trying to mash out of the combo, and you will get hit purely for trying that, whereas the V-reversal has enough invincibility to poke and usually knock down Ed without you having to suffer this fate. If you're good enough at playing neutral with Ed, he shouldn't be able to create those scenarios often enough that he can just afford to always go, okay, yeah, you're gonna reverse me, let's go for the throw. He has to try for pressure and control at some point, and if you can judge those points for yourself, then getting him off you is often really helpful.
Oh man, down to the wire.
If nothing else, it's because it stops him from getting that steamroll into meter. Ed is not a character that needs a lot of meter to function. Especially if he's just playing neutral. If he's not in his phase where he needs to throw fireballs at you, and therefore for some reason he EX one, if he's not being pressured, he just gets to build up meter. He has moves that don't require EX to be helpful. Therefore, anything you can do to force him to spend it, or even just keep it fairly even because he doesn't get to keep on hitting you for pressure and building up faster than you can, will help you get through the match. Similarly, because Ed will sometimes have to stop because you have the option to view reversal. He's not one of those characters who gets to just do something else crazy to bypass neutral or the view reversal itself.
Ed wins.
But, as we said before, if you're going to play a Footsie's Ed that has actually spent a lot of time on this, you're going to have to work really hard.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Willie?
Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
This matchup is one of the ones where the aforementioned lack of a use of a bot actually matters. Kareem's anti-air ability, going up against Ed's jumping along with everything else he does, it generally means you have to be better at it because she doesn't have as many options. He can fake his way around her uppercut, he can beat her jump medium punch. Meaning that he gets to bypass the footsies where he is finally equaled by finding the right timing and moment to jump.
Round one. Fight.
Kareem therefore spends a lot of time working on exactly what Ed Lock is about. If she doesn't dash in and throw him or poke him at some point, Ed has all of the offense and she gets to do very little. Yes, even Kareem gets to do very little. She can play supremely good footsies, but if you're facing your equal in the footsies department in this matchup, she's not easily beaten. You can play very defensively and make that your MO, which will give her the advantage again. Even if only because she has certain flow options that Ed cannot match. But in terms of really keeping Ed at bay without playing in a sort of slow way, she has to find that moment. But specifically, putting Ed in the situation where he thinks you're going to try to throw him changes his flow. And that part is probably the important part. Our Ed bot does not, however, train you to reversal him, so that's the sort of thing you have to build up on your own. And again, it doesn't really come up against most Ed because they don't play footsies in the first place, and their pressure strings are backdashable a lot of the time. Mainly because they have no interest in playing footsie, so they just use the same pressure strings over and over. But we're going from someone who has had very little Edbot experience to possibly someone who has had none, but I'm not sure because it depends on how far apart they were. This one might get a little laggy depending on location. You can get pretty good connections to Europe from where we are, but it depends on whether or not our newcomer is on the other side of the coast than Suntier is. So hopefully it won't be too terrible, but even if it's pretty bad, probably it's not necessarily a reason to ditch out the new side. They keep on claiming that frame drops are not related to stages. I can believe that now that everyone has gone through all the code and figured out why it is that certain things go certain ways. We'll see what Capcom does about it, if anything. Maybe PS4 was endorsing their limitation. But we're not going to be able to tell easily from here if it's laggy or not, so we're just watching hope that it's not terrible. But as noted, yeah, Sunday has zero Edbot experience. Which is likely to become a big issue because the way that Akuma has to punish things Ed does is super unintuitive. Basically nothing that Ed actually does looks like... The punishes for them never look like what they should be. Meaning that Akuma often has to rely on just keeping advantage by using standard beam kick or throw without the expectation that he will actually be able to get a full combo, because if he tries and is wrong, often advantage switches to Ed.
Round 2. Fight.
Fortunately, Suntier quite likes playing footsies, even with characters who have strong footsies of their own. This is probably the completely optimal feature of this match. You don't really want a closer to you anyway, and even if you got him closer to you, what would happen? He'd uppercut. This is also one of the few matchups where Akuma's most recent nerf, specifically the inability to just cancel off the fireball without the kick, matters. And that V-freeze also adds to the problem, because learning the timing for uppercutting through that move is something you really do have to practice a lot. In fact, a large part of the reason why Edbot is built the way it is to just spam that sometimes is because the sheer number of times where you can take a round with Ed simply by knowing how to get through that move, whatever option your character has, at whatever range you happen to be. Okay, I'm going to assume it's at least a little laggy based on what I just said. But on the other hand, they did continue. That could easily be that the specifics of this matchup don't really require the lag to be not so great. Which reminds me that we should probably be doing that soon too. The lounge tends to stay open for a while longer, so you can feel free to come on in and get sub matches. We tend to drift off, which actually means that it's easier to get the matches simply because there are going to be less people in the lounge to rotate. Normally the lounge stays open for another half an hour at minimum, sometimes it's longer than that. So if you do still want to join us, once again search 3 rounds versus 2 with character select off. And you should be able to find an siren.
Down to the wire.
If you choose to come in a little later, you might need to search for someone else. So, you know, pay some attention to who is in the lounge as of now, just in case it does close out from this side and we find ourselves with a different lounge host. And of course, bear in mind that we still don't think they've solved that problem. Sometimes you do get the inability to find the lounge at all. Unfortunately, unless you made the note now that you want to be invited, that's not likely to happen. So if you do want to get in here, you should make a note in chat, because we're probably not going to be monitoring chat for all that much longer once the stream is out, obviously.
Ed wins.
But for one with no Ed bot experience, that went decently well. So we're going to go into our last on-stream match of the night. Probably rotating around for DeWolf to get his rematch. As for other content this week, we do need to work on Helena bot, which means we're only going to guarantee Thursday's Kame House. But we haven't actually had Tuesday training in a bit. And people are probably in the mood to get some Unist in. It could be Guilty Gear, but I'm expecting more likely to be Unist.
Well, ain't you a high
Wednesday,
def picture of
unlikely to be
strength?
content.
I'm
If we're
shaking
doing
here.
anything Wednesday, we'll probably be working on Helena bot, and we probably won't be streaming that. But you might get a sandbag casuals from someone if you just want to hang on and watch some Street Fighter. Don't count on it though. As always, you can check our Twitter @2_K_FGC to find out what we are streaming, when, and potentially why we are not streaming. Sometimes we have to report that we're late, for example. Kame House has been, for various reasons, ended up being slightly late for a couple weeks now. But if Helena bot is ready fully by Friday, you will get a disc guidance for that then. Dead or Alive is still not the most popular game, but it is free. And does have some character rotations.
Round 2.
So it's hard to have any quote-unquote excuses for it. If it plays at your local, for example, or you know people who are into it, not getting at least a couple games this week. We would probably play it more if not for the fact that Friday tends to be busy. Or someone's at a tournament, or some tournament is going on that for some reason we are watching. Sadly, the bot development gets held up by the fact that like many games we seem to be working on lately, we don't get to save it. And the OA system is particularly strict in that they're almost useless in the normal sense that you'd use Street Fighter ones, because I don't think they use the save between matches still. That was quite a sequence. You can of course join us next Monday for more Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge. This particular stream is very consistent, even if sometimes the host of it is a little different. You should always be able to find us at this time, whether or not we're playing 3 rounds first to 1, or characters let on or off. Those things shift around, but the main deal remains the same. Play some Street Fighter, and most of the time listen to me talk. One thing the Cali players should note is that you generally don't want to put down the crawlies right away on a knockdown. Take a couple steps, or even dash, but dashing is unpredictable. I'm not going to go into much detail on it on this stream. I just thought it was something I should probably bring up if it ever came up, because it makes a large difference to the effectiveness of the setup if you did a knockdown that doesn't give you a real setup. If you're not in the corner, but you decide, I want to use this anyway, I don't really think I want to chase down this opponent for whatever reason.
Round 2.
Take a couple steps before using the move, because it will change a lot of properties of your interactions with the other player. Since it acts as a shield, your aim is usually to get the move out at the exact moment your opponent could get up to the move. And against basically anyone other than Cammy, it's a good thing. Which leaves us with a considerable likelihood. Not even that considerable, honestly. But like I said, you have to get really used to it, exactly how to wake up through that move if you have an invincible move to do it with. So, that brings us to the end of this stream. Once again, please feel free to join the lounge. It is 3 rounds first to 2 with character select off. This has been Rillian, along with Kansuki Dynasty, for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.